The Clockmaker's Heir. Chapter 1, The Legacy Left Behind. The town of Hallows End had always felt like a place frozen in time. Its cobblestone streets were slick with the morning's drizzle, and the fog that clung to the rooftops seemed to muffle every sound. Ellie Danvers pulled her suitcase behind her, its wheels rattling loudly in the eerie stillness. She paused outside a shop with a faded wooden sign that read Danvers Clocks, time perfected since 1887. This was it. Her inheritance. Ellie adjusted her scarf, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. She barely remembered her grandfather. The last time she'd seen him, she was a child, standing in this very shop as he tinkered with gears and springs. Her mother had cut ties with him soon after, citing his obsession with old clocks as dangerous. Ellie had never understood why, until now, as she stood outside the shop, staring at the darkened windows and peeling paint. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy oak door, a bell jingled above her head, and the scent of wood polish and aged metal enveloped her. Inside, the shop was exactly as she remembered, shelves lined with clocks of all shapes and sizes, their ticking forming an oddly harmonious rhythm. A massive grandfather clock dominated the far wall, its golden pendulum swaying hypnotically. Ellie set her suitcase down and took a tentative step forward. Welcome home. Ellie. She jumped, spinning around. A man stood in the doorway behind her, dressed in a dark coat and a bowler hat. He held a small parcel in his gloved hands. Who? Ellie began, but the man cut her off with a polite smile. My name is Arthur Kent. I represent the estate of your late grandfather, Mr. Elias Danvers. His voice was crisp and professional, but his eyes held a curious gleam. I didn't know he had an estate, Ellie said, folding her arms. Kent stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Your grandfather's affairs were rather unique, Miss Danvers. He left specific instructions that you were to inherit the shop and everything within it. He handed her the parcel. This is for you. It was found in his study. Ellie hesitated before taking it. The parcel was wrapped in brown paper, tied with a thin cord. She set it on the counter and opened it carefully. Inside was a small brass key and a letter written in her grandfather's neat, looping handwriting. Dear Ellie, if you are reading this, then I am no longer here. I regret that we did not have more time together, but perhaps it is fitting that you now hold the key to the clocks. They are more than simple machines, as I suspect you will soon discover. Be cautious, my dear. There are those who seek to misuse what I have built. Trust no one until you understand the truth of our family's legacy. The key will unlock the heart of the shop. You will know it when you see it. With all my love, grandfather. Ellie stared at the letter, her heart pounding. What is this? She murmured. Kent cleared his throat, drawing her attention. I must advise caution, Miss Danvers. Your grandfather's work attracted unusual interest. He was a brilliant man, but his ideas often crossed the line between genius and madness. What kind of interest? Ellie asked sharply. Kent hesitated. There were rumors of experiments with time, of clocks that did more than measure the hours. I cannot say how much is true, but your grandfather's death was sudden. A chill ran down Ellie's spine. What happened to him? Kent adjusted his hat, his expression unreadable. He was found in his workshop. No signs of foul play, but the clocks were all stopped at the same moment, 3:33 a.m. Ellie glanced around the shop uneasily. The rhythmic ticking of the clocks suddenly felt oppressive, their sound filling every corner of the room. If you need assistance, I suggest contacting Tobias Reed, Kent continued. He was an associate of your grandfather's, a clockmaker himself. He may be able to explain things better than I can. With that, Kent tipped his hat and left, leaving Ellie alone in the shop. She turned back to the letter and the brass key, her mind racing. What did her grandfather mean by the heart of the shop? And what was she supposed to discover? Her eyes fell on the massive grandfather clock against the far wall. It was intricately carved, with an inscription on its brass face that read, Tempus Custos, keeper of time. Ellie stepped closer, the key in her hand. The key slid into the lock beneath the clock's face with a satisfying click. The moment she turned it, the clock shuddered, its pendulum stopping mid-swing. Then, with a low groan, the entire clock slid backward, revealing a hidden staircase descending into darkness. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. This was the heart of the shop, and whatever lay below, she was about to find out. Chapter 2, Whispers of Time. Ellie stood frozen, staring at the hidden staircase revealed by the grandfather clock. Cold air wafted up from below, carrying the faint scent of oil and metal. The dim light from the shop didn't reach far into the shadows, but she could make out the edges of stone steps spiraling downward. Her fingers tightened around the brass key, her pulse quickening. Her grandfather had hidden this for a reason. Did she dare step into the unknown? The ticking of the clocks around her seemed louder now, almost urging her forward. Taking a deep breath, Ellie grabbed a flashlight from the counter and descended the stairs. The staircase led to a workshop unlike anything Ellie had ever seen. The room was vast, its walls lined with shelves filled with gears, springs, and intricate tools. A massive workbench dominated the center, covered in partially assembled clock mechanisms. Strange diagrams were tacked to the walls, depicting clocks with unusual features, some with overlapping faces, others with strange symbols etched into their designs. But what drew Ellie's attention most was the clock at the far end of the room. It stood taller than the grandfather clock upstairs, its surface gleaming with polished brass and ebony. Its face had no numbers, only a series of interlocking rings that rotated slowly, each etched with glowing symbols. The pendulum hung motionless, yet Ellie felt as though the entire clock hummed with energy. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind, "They are more than simple machines." Ellie approached the clock cautiously. She reached out to touch the polished surface, but the moment her fingers brushed against it, the room seemed to tilt, the air shimmered, and Ellie stumbled back, gripping the edge of the workbench to steady herself. The world around her flickered, and for a brief moment, she saw a figure standing where she had just been, a younger version of her grandfather, hunched over the clock as he worked. "Almost there," he murmured, his voice faint and distorted. Ellie blinked, and the vision disappeared. The workshop returned to normal, but her heart raced. What was that? She whispered. Before Ellie could process what she'd seen, a loud crash came from above. Her head snapped toward the staircase. Someone was in the shop. Ellie turned off her flashlight and climbed the stairs cautiously, peering through the narrow gap at the edge of the clock. A man stood in the shop, silhouetted by the faint light coming through the windows. He was tall, dressed in a long coat and hat, and carried a cane with a silver handle. Ellie's breath caught. "I know you're here, Miss Danvers," the man called out, his voice smooth and commanding. "My name is Magnus Graves. I've come to discuss your grandfather's work." Ellie remained silent, her heart pounding. Magnus stepped closer to the counter, running a gloved hand over the surface. "Your grandfather was a genius, but he kept secrets. Dangerous secrets. I believe you've inherited them." He turned toward the grandfather clock, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "We don't have to be adversaries, Miss Danvers. The Order of the Hourglass simply wants to protect what your grandfather created. Surely you understand the importance of safeguarding such power." Ellie's grip tightened on the edge of the hidden doorway. The Hourglass Order. That was the group mentioned in her grandfather's journal. Magnus tapped his cane on the floor impatiently. "If you're here, come out. Refusing to cooperate would be unwise." Ellie's mind raced. She had no idea what this man wanted or what he was capable of, but her instincts told her to stay hidden. Magnus sighed and turned toward the door. "Very well. I'll return soon, Miss Danvers. But know this, time waits for no one, not even you." With that, he left, the shop bell jingling softly as the door closed behind him. Ellie waited several minutes before emerging from the hidden staircase. Her hands were shaking as she locked the grandfather clock back into place. Magnus' words echoed in her mind, dangerous secrets. Safeguarding such power. She had to figure out what her grandfather had been working on, and fast, grabbing the journal she'd found earlier, Ellie sat at the counter and flipped through the pages. Her grandfather's meticulous handwriting filled the book, detailing his experiments with clocks that could interact with time's flow. One passage caught her eye: the temporal timekeepers harness fragments of time itself. Each clock is attuned to a specific aspect: acceleration, deceleration, reversal. The largest, the eternal clock, controls the flow entirely. It must never be activated without great care. The consequences would be catastrophic. Ellie's stomach twisted. Was the clock in the workshop the eternal clock? If so, what did it mean that she'd activated something simply by touching it? As she skimmed further, another entry made her blood run cold: the Hourglass Order grows restless. They believe the clocks can be used to rewrite history, to undo mistakes. But time is not meant to be tampered with. I must hide the eternal clock. If they find it, they will tear the world apart. Ellie slammed the journal shut. Her grandfather had died trying to protect these clocks. Now the Order was after her. She looked around the shop, her gaze settling on the shelves of clocks ticking away in perfect unison. Somewhere in this mess of gears and timepieces lay the answers she needed, but she wasn't sure how much time she had to find them. Chapter 3: The Clockmaker's Journal. The shop was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clocks. Ellie sat at the counter, the journal open before her, her mind swirling with questions. Magnus Graves' visit had shaken her, but it had also lit a fire in her, a determination to uncover what her grandfather had been hiding and why the Order wanted it so badly. The journal was thick, its pages yellowed and frayed at the edges. Each entry painted a vivid picture of her grandfather's life, his obsession with clocks, and his growing fear of the Hourglass Order. As Ellie read, she began to piece together the story of the temporal timekeepers. Today, I completed the first of the timekeepers. It is a small device, no larger than a pocket watch, but it holds within it the ability to accelerate time in a localized area. The implications are staggering. If used wisely, it could save lives, prevent disasters. But in the wrong hands, it could be devastating. I will keep this one hidden until I perfect the others. Ellie frowned. Accelerating time. It sounded impossible, but then again, she had seen the eternal clock shift reality with her own eyes. Her fingers traced over a rough sketch of the pocket watch in the margin, its design intricate and unfamiliar. If her grandfather had hidden these devices, where had he put them? She flipped to another page, this one marked with a smudge of ink as if it had been written in haste. They call themselves protectors of time, but their true motives are far from noble. Magnus Graves has offered me wealth, power, even protection for my family if I hand over the eternal clock. I refused. He does not understand that time is not a weapon to be wielded, nor a resource to be exploited. It is sacred. I fear they will not take no for an answer. Ellie felt a pang of guilt. Her mother had always said that her grandfather's obsession with clocks had cost him everything, but now she realized he had been protecting his family all along. She wondered if her mother even knew the truth about the clocks, or if she'd left to shield Ellie from the dangers her grandfather had faced. Ellie turned to the final entries in the journal. They were Messier, the handwriting jagged, as though written under duress: the eternal clock must be moved. The workshop is no longer safe. Tobias has agreed to help me construct a vault beneath the shop. It will be accessible only through the main clock face, and only by those who possess the key. Even if the Order finds the shop, they will not find the clock without the key. Ellie's breath caught. She had already used the key to access the staircase. But the workshop below had been exposed. Was there another layer of protection she hadn't found yet? To whoever reads this, trust no one. The clocks are more dangerous than I ever imagined. If the eternal clock is activated fully, it could unravel the threads of time itself. Be vigilant. The Order will stop at nothing to control it. If I do not survive, know that I did everything I could to protect this legacy. I only hope it will be enough. Ellie closed the journal, her hands trembling. She felt the weight of her grandfather's warnings pressing down on her. Magnus Graves wasn't just interested in the clocks, he believed they could grant him control over time. And from what she had seen, he might be right, she needed help. Later that day, Ellie found herself standing outside the modest shop of Tobias Reed, the clockmaker her grandfather had mentioned. The sign above the door read Reed Repairs, Fine Watches and Timepieces. The door opened with a faint creak, and a small bell jingled to announce her arrival. The shop smelled of varnish and metal, and shelves of delicate watches and clocks lined the walls. Behind the counter stood a man in his late 60s, his hands deftly working on the gears of a pocket watch. His silver hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and his sharp eyes glanced up at her over thin-rimmed glasses. "Miss Danvers," he said before she could introduce herself. "I've been expecting you." Ellie blinked in surprise. "You have?" Tobias nodded, setting down his tools. "Your grandfather told me you might come, though I didn't think it would happen under these circumstances. I'm sorry for your loss." Ellie hesitated. "Did he tell you about the clocks? About what they can do?" Tobias's expression darkened. "I know enough to understand why the order is after you. Your grandfather and I worked together for years to keep the temporal timekeepers safe. But now that Elias is gone..." He sighed. "It's up to you to continue his work." "I don't even know where to start," Ellie admitted. The order came to the shop. Magnus Graves himself. Tobias stiffened at the name. "Graves is dangerous. He's been hunting your grandfather's work for decades. If he's found you, it means he's getting desperate. He must believe you know where the eternal clock is." "I've seen it," Ellie said. "It's in the workshop under the shop." Tobias's eyes widened. "The eternal clock is still there? Intact?" Ellie nodded. "I touched it, and it showed me something. A vision of my grandfather." Tobias rubbed his chin, his brow furrowed. "The eternal clock is powerful, but it's also unpredictable. If you've activated it, the order will stop at nothing to get it." "Then how do I stop them?" Ellie asked. Tobias's gaze hardened. "By understanding the clocks and their power. Your grandfather left you the key, but the knowledge you need is locked within the timekeepers themselves. We have to work quickly, Ellie. Time is no longer on our side." Chapter 4, Gears in Motion. Tobias led Ellie to the back of his shop, where the air was thick with the scent of oil and dust. He unlocked a heavy wooden door, revealing a small workshop illuminated by a single hanging lamp. Unlike the cluttered space upstairs, this room was meticulously organized. Blueprints of clocks and intricate mechanisms covered the walls, while a massive oak workbench stood at the center, laden with tools. "Your grandfather and I used this space for our most secret work," Tobias said, gesturing to the blueprints. "We designed the temporal timekeepers here before realizing how dangerous they were. That's when Elias decided to hide them." Ellie studied the drawings. Each depicted a clock more elaborate than the last, with annotations in her grandfather's elegant handwriting. One blueprint, however, stood out, a clock surrounded by swirling lines, with the words "Eternal Clock" scrawled beneath it. "This is the one I found," Ellie said, pointing to it. Tobias nodded grimly. "The eternal clock is the heart of your grandfather's work. It doesn't just measure time, it manipulates it. The interlocking rings you saw represent different time flows: acceleration, deceleration, reversal, and stasis. It can bend time to the will of its user." Ellie felt a chill run through her. Why would he create something like that? Tobias sighed. He didn't intend for it to be a tool of control. He believed it could be used to heal, to undo tragedies or prevent disasters. But the more we worked on it, the more he realized the dangers. Time is not meant to be rewritten, Ellie. The fabric of reality is fragile. One wrong move, and it could unravel entirely. Tobias pulled a dusty ledger from a nearby shelf and opened it to a page marked with a red ribbon. "These are the locations of the other timekeepers," he explained. "Your grandfather scattered them across the region, hiding each one in a place he believed was secure. Together, they form a network that powers the eternal clock. If the Order gets hold of even one. He trailed off, but Ellie understood. The timekeepers were the keys to unlocking the full power of the eternal clock. Then we have to find them before the Order does, Ellie said, her resolve hardening. Tobias smiled faintly. Spoken like a true Danvers. The first location listed in the ledger was an abandoned church on the outskirts of town. Tobias and Ellie wasted no time, packing tools, a flashlight, and the journal before setting out in Tobias's old pickup truck. The drive was quiet except for the hum of the engine. As they approached the church, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees lining the road seemed to close in, their branches casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Are you sure the Order doesn't know about this place? Ellie asked, gripping the journal tightly. As sure as I can be, Tobias replied. Your grandfather chose locations that were remote and inconspicuous. But the Order has its ways. We'll have to be careful. The church loomed ahead, its steeple rising against the night sky like a jagged shadow. The building was crumbling, its stained glass windows shattered and its wooden doors hanging askew. Ellie shivered as they stepped inside, their footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The air was damp and cold, and the faint scent of mildew lingered. Over here, Tobias whispered, leading her to the altar. He knelt and began feeling around the edges of the stone platform. After a few moments, his fingers found a hidden latch. With a grunt, he pulled it, and a section of the altar slid aside, revealing a small compartment. Inside was a clock no larger than a shoebox, its brass casing tarnished with age. Unlike the eternal clock, this one had a single face with glowing blue hands that ticked backward. The reversal timekeeper, Tobias said softly, lifting it carefully. Ellie stared at the clock in awe. This can turn back time. In small increments, Tobias replied. A few seconds, maybe a minute at most. But even that can have profound consequences. Before Ellie could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the church. Someone's here, she hissed. Tobias's expression darkened. The Order. They scrambled to hide behind a row of pews as the footsteps grew louder. Peering through a crack in the wood, Ellie saw two figures enter the church, their faces obscured by the shadows. One of them carried a lantern, its light casting an eerie glow across the walls. They're close, one of them said in a low voice. The ledger must have led them here. Ellie's heart raced. They couldn't let the Order find the timekeeper, or them. Tobias handed Ellie the clock. Take this and run, he whispered. What? No. Ellie protested in a harsh whisper. There's no time to argue, Tobias insisted. I'll distract them. You head for the truck and get out of here. I'll meet you back at the shop. Ellie hesitated, but the sound of the figures drawing closer forced her hand. Clutching the timekeeper, she slipped out the back of the church, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. She ran through the trees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she reached the truck, she climbed inside and started the engine, her hands trembling. As she pulled away, she glanced back at the church, dread tightening in her chest. She hoped Tobias would make it out safely, but deep down, she feared the Order was already one step ahead. Chapter 5, Fractures in Time. Ellie sat behind the wheel of Tobias's truck, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. The reversal timekeeper sat on the passenger seat, its faint blue glow pulsing in rhythm with the ticking of its hands. The truck's engine rumbled as Ellie drove back toward the shop, her mind racing with worry. Tobias had told her to run, but guilt gnawed at her. What if the Order had captured him? What if she had left him behind to face Magnus Graves alone? As the truck rattled over the uneven road, Ellie's gaze kept flicking to the glowing clock. It seemed so small, so delicate, yet it held the power to reverse moments in time. What if I could use it to help Tobias? She thought. She shook her head, Tobias's warning echoing in her mind. Time is not meant to be rewritten. Still, the idea lingered. When Ellie arrived at the shop, the streets were eerily quiet. She parked the truck in the alley behind the building, her heart sinking as she noticed the lights inside were still off. Cautiously, she stepped inside, locking the door behind her. The shop felt colder than usual, the ticking of the clocks louder in the silence. "Tobias?" She called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Ellie set the reversal timekeeper on the counter and paced nervously. She checked the journal, flipping through the pages for any clue about what to do next. The weight of responsibility felt heavier than ever. She thought of the other timekeepers hidden across the region. If Tobias had been captured, or worse, how was she supposed to retrieve them on her own? As she turned to another page, a sudden knock at the door startled her. Ellie froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Miss Danvers," a familiar voice called. Smooth, cold, and calculated. "Magnus Graves." Ellie grabbed the timekeeper and backed away from the door, searching for an escape route. She could hear Magnus' cane tapping against the ground as he waited. "I know you're in there," Magnus continued. "You've made progress, haven't you? Found the first timekeeper. Clever girl." Ellie's chest tightened. "How did he know? You can't run forever," Magnus said, his tone almost amused. "The clocks belong to the Order. They're wasted on you." Ellie's eyes darted toward the staircase leading to the hidden workshop. Without another thought, she sprinted toward it, clutching the timekeeper tightly. The workshop felt safer, but only marginally. Ellie locked the door behind her and placed the reversal timekeeper on the workbench, its glow illuminating the cluttered room. Magnus' voice carried faintly through the floorboards above. "You know, your grandfather thought he could outwit us too. Look where that got him." Ellie's anger flared. How dare he speak about her grandfather like that? She turned her attention to the glowing clock. Her fingers hovered over its polished surface, her mind racing. Could she use it to escape? Or even to stop Magnus? The journal's warnings came back to her. "The clocks are more dangerous than I ever imagined." Ellie clenched her fists. She didn't have time for doubt. She carefully turned the dial on the reversal timekeeper, aligning its hands with the glowing symbols etched onto its face. The clock's hum grew louder, and the room seemed to shimmer around her. For a moment, Ellie felt disoriented. The air around her felt thicker, and the ticking of the clock sounded muffled, as if underwater. When the sensation passed, Ellie found herself standing back in the shop, but something was off. The air smelled fresher, and the clocks on the walls were running slightly slower. A sound from behind made her spin around. Tobias was there, alive and unharmed, crouched behind the counter and clutching a heavy wrench. His eyes widened when he saw her. "Ellie? How?" he started. But she cut him off. "There's no time to explain," she said, her voice urgent. "Magnus Graves is coming. We have to move." Tobias blinked, confused, but he nodded. "If Magnus is here, he'll stop at nothing to get the timekeeper." Ellie glanced at the reversal timekeeper in her hands. "This brought me back a few minutes, but it won't be enough to stop him. What do we do?" Tobias's gaze hardened. "We fight." Together, they worked quickly. Tobias armed himself with a toolkit filled with heavy tools and improvised weapons, while Ellie locked down the shop as best she could. When Magnus arrived, his confident smirk faltered slightly at the sight of Tobias standing beside Ellie. "Well," Magnus said, twirling his cane, "this is unexpected. A reunion of sorts." "Stay away from her," Tobias growled. Magnus chuckled. "Touching. But you know as well as I do that you can't protect her. The clocks belong to the Order. Hand over the timekeeper, and perhaps I'll spare you both." Ellie felt a surge of defiance. "You'll have to take it from me." Magnus' smile faded, and he raised his cane, which glinted with a strange metallic sheen. Before Ellie could react, he tapped the floor with it, and the room seemed to shift. The clocks on the walls began ticking erratically, their hands spinning wildly. Ellie staggered, clutching the reversal timekeeper. Tobias grabbed her arm, steadying her. "He's using a temporal disruptor," Tobias said grimly. "It's designed to destabilize time in localized areas. We have to stop him before it overwhelms us." Ellie's mind raced. She looked at the reversal timekeeper, its blue glow flickering as if reacting to the disruption. She turned the dial again, this time aligning it with a different symbol. The clock's hum grew louder, and a wave of energy rippled outward, countering the effects of Magnus' device. Magnus' eyes narrowed. Clever. But you're playing with forces you don't understand. The confrontation escalated into chaos. Magnus lunged toward them, but Tobias intercepted him, wielding a wrench with surprising agility. Ellie worked frantically, trying to stabilize the reversal timekeeper to prevent it from overloading. In the end, it wasn't brute strength that decided the outcome but Ellie's quick thinking. She activated the timekeeper once more, freezing Magnus in a bubble of temporal stasis. He stood frozen mid-motion, his expression a mix of rage and surprise. Tobias panted, lowering his wrench. You did it. Ellie stared at Magnus, her hands trembling. For now. But this isn't over. Tobias nodded grimly. We need to secure the timekeeper and move to the next location. The order won't stop until they have them all. Ellie glanced at the reversal timekeeper, its glow dimming. She had only begun to understand its power, but she knew one thing for certain: her journey was far from over. Chapter 6, The Fractured Path. The shop was eerily silent in the aftermath of the confrontation with Magnus Graves. Ellie stood over his frozen form, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. The reversal timekeeper, now dim, rested heavily in her hands. Tobias leaned against the counter, catching his breath. You managed to stall him, but this won't hold forever. Temporal stasis is unstable. He'll break free sooner than you think. Ellie turned to Tobias, her voice trembling. Then we have to keep moving. The ledger, what's the next location? Tobias nodded, wiping his brow. He retrieved the journal and flipped through its pages, his finger tracing the handwritten notes. The second timekeeper, he said, is hidden in an old lighthouse near the coast. Your grandfather chose it because it's isolated and difficult to access. But if the Order knows about the ledger, they might already be there. Ellie finished. Exactly. Ellie and Tobias wasted no time preparing for the journey. Tobias armed himself with a reinforced case to protect the timekeeper, while Ellie packed the journal, tools, and provisions. Every moment felt like a race against the Order, the weight of their mission pressing down on them. The two piled into Tobias's truck, leaving the shop behind. The drive to the coast was long and tense, the silence broken only by the occasional groan of the truck's engine. Ellie kept glancing at the reversal timekeeper, its glow faint but steady. Do you think Magnus will come after us? She asked. Tobias tightened his grip on the steering wheel. It's not a matter of if. It's when. The Order won't let us slip away easily, especially not after what you did to him. Ellie looked out the window, the passing landscape blurring into shades of gray. I didn't mean to. I just acted. You did what you had to, Tobias said firmly. And you bought us time. That's what matters. By the time they reached the lighthouse, the sky was dark, and the ocean churned violently against the cliffs. The lighthouse stood like a solitary sentinel, its light sweeping the stormy sea. Ellie shivered as she stepped out of the truck, pulling her jacket tighter against the biting wind. Tobias carried the reinforced case, his expression grim. This way, he said, leading her toward the structure. The path to the lighthouse was treacherous, the rocky terrain slick with rain. Ellie stumbled several times, but Tobias was there to steady her. When they finally reached the door, Tobias produced a small key from his pocket. Your grandfather trusted me with this, he said, unlocking the heavy iron door. The interior of the lighthouse was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of salt and decay. Ellie followed Tobias up a spiral staircase, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. At the top, they found a small room cluttered with old furniture and nautical equipment. In the center of the room sat a wooden chest, its surface covered in carvings of gears and constellations. This is it, Tobias said, kneeling beside the chest. Ellie watched as he carefully opened it, revealing a second timekeeper nestled inside. This one was larger than the reversal timekeeper, its casing silver and adorned with intricate patterns. Its hands moved erratically, casting faint golden light across the room. The stasis timekeeper, Tobias whispered. It can freeze moments in time, creating pockets of stillness. In the right hands, it can save lives. In the wrong hands. He didn't need to finish the thought. Ellie reached out to touch the clock, but Tobias stopped her. Not yet, he said. These timekeepers are unpredictable, especially when they're not connected to the eternal clock. We'll secure it first, then figure out how to use it. Ellie nodded, stepping back. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the lighthouse, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. They're here, Tobias hissed. Ellie's heart leapt into her throat. What do we do? Tobias grabbed the stasis timekeeper and placed it in the reinforced case. We defend ourselves. The two of them scrambled down the staircase, their footsteps quick but quiet. As they reached the base of the lighthouse, they saw the Order's agents, 3 figures in dark coats, forcing their way through the door. Split up, Tobias whispered. I'll draw them away. You take the case and head back to the truck. Ellie hesitated, her grip tightening on the case. What if something happens to you? I've faced worse, Tobias said with a faint smile. Just go. Protect the timekeeper. Ellie swallowed hard but nodded. She slipped out a side door, clutching the case tightly as she made her way back to the truck. The storm had intensified, rain lashing against her face as she navigated the slippery path. The wind howled, masking the sounds of the struggle inside the lighthouse. When Ellie reached the truck, she threw the case onto the passenger seat and started the engine. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the lighthouse in the distance. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Finally, Tobias emerged from the shadows, his clothes soaked and his face streaked with dirt. He climbed into the truck, slamming the door behind him. Go. He shouted. Ellie didn't need to be told twice. She floored the accelerator, the truck skidding slightly as it sped away from the lighthouse. What happened? She asked, glancing at Tobias. I managed to slow them down, he said, breathing heavily. But they won't stop. Not until they have all the timekeepers. Ellie nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we won't let them. We'll finish what my grandfather started. Tobias looked at her, his expression a mix of pride and concern. You're braver than you know, Ellie. But the road ahead won't be easy. I don't care, she said firmly. The Order has taken enough from my family. It's time we fought back. As the truck roared down the winding road, the glow of the stasis timekeeper illuminated the interior, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. Chapter 7, Threads of Time. Ellie and Tobias drove in tense silence, the storm raging outside. The weight of the stasis timekeeper pressed heavily on Ellie's lap, its golden glow reflecting off the rain-slicked windows. She kept glancing at Tobias, his jaw set and his hands gripping the wheel tightly. What's the next step? She finally asked. Tobias exhaled slowly. There's one more timekeeper your grandfather hid before he could dismantle the eternal clock. If we retrieve it, we'll have the pieces needed to secure the network, or destroy it. Ellie nodded, her determination unwavering. Where is it? Tobias hesitated. It's the most dangerous location yet. He hid it in the vaults beneath the Order's headquarters. Her stomach dropped. You're joking. I wish I were, Tobias said grimly. But Elias believed the best place to hide something was often in plain sight. The Order would never suspect it's been under their noses the whole time. Ellie stared at him, her pulse quickening. How are we supposed to get in there? Magnus and his agents will be everywhere. Tobias gave her a small, wry smile. That's where my experience with the Order comes in handy. I know their routines, their weak spots. It won't be easy, but it's possible. The two stopped at an abandoned cabin deep in the woods to regroup. Tobias laid out a rough plan, sketching maps from memory and detailing the Order's security measures. The vaults are heavily guarded, but there's a service entrance they rarely use, he explained, pointing to a corner of the map. It leads directly to the lower levels. If we time it right, we can slip in during the shift change. Ellie listened intently, her anxiety building. What happens if we're caught? Tobias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he met her gaze, his expression serious. If we're caught, they'll take the timekeepers. And us. The unspoken and what happens after that hung heavy in the air. As night fell, the storm eased, leaving the woods shrouded in mist. Ellie and Tobias prepared for the infiltration, packing only the essentials. Tobias handed Ellie a compact bag filled with tools and gadgets. Including a small device resembling a pocket watch. What's this? Ellie asked, examining it. A disruption mechanism, Tobias said. It's designed to interfere with the Order's temporal scanners. It won't last long, but it'll give us a small window to move undetected. Ellie slipped the device into her jacket pocket. Let's hope it works. Tobias gave her a reassuring nod. It will. Just stay close and follow my lead. The Order's headquarters was an imposing structure, a blend of Gothic and modern architecture. Its spires pierced the night sky, and its windows glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. Ellie's heart pounded as she and Tobias approached the service entrance, keeping to the shadows. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified by her heightened senses. Tobias crouched near the door, producing a small tool to disable the lock. Keep watch, he whispered. Ellie nodded, her eyes scanning the darkened courtyard. She felt exposed, as if invisible eyes were watching her every move. Finally, the lock clicked open, and Tobias pushed the door inward. We're in, he said. The service corridor was narrow and dimly lit. The walls lined with pipes that hissed faintly. Ellie followed Tobias closely, clutching the bag of tools. Down here, Tobias whispered, leading her to a staircase that spiraled into the depths of the building. The air grew colder as they descended, the hum of machinery growing louder. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a vast underground chamber filled with rows of locked vaults. This is it, Tobias said, his voice low. Ellie stared at the vaults, her stomach churning. How do we know which one holds the timekeeper? Tobias pointed to a symbol etched into the nearest vault, an intricate design of gears and stars. Elias marked them. Look for this. The search was painstaking, each second feeling like an eternity. Ellie's palms were sweaty as she traced the marks on each vault, her nerves on edge. Finally, she found it, a vault with the same symbol etched into its center. Over here. She whispered. Tobias hurried over, his face lighting up with relief. Good. Now, let's open it. He produced a strange key, a brass device that clicked and whirred as he inserted it into the lock. The vault groaned as it swung open, revealing the third timekeeper inside. This one was different from the others. Its casing was jet black, and its hands moved in erratic, unpredictable patterns. The distortion timekeeper, Tobias said, his voice almost reverent. It manipulates the flow of time itself, creating rifts that can disorient anyone caught in them. Ellie shuddered. It looks alive. It might as well be, Tobias said, carefully lifting it. This is the last piece. With this, we can decide the fate of the eternal clock. Before they could leave, a harsh voice echoed through the chamber. Well, well. I knew you'd come here eventually, Magnus Graves said, stepping into the light. Ellie's blood ran cold. Magnus was flanked by two agents, their faces obscured by masks. You've led us on quite the chase, Magnus said, his smirk venomous. But it ends here. Hand over the timekeepers. Ellie stepped forward, her jaw clenched. You'll have to take them from us. Magnus' smile widened. Oh, I intend to. The confrontation erupted into chaos. Tobias threw the disruption mechanism, its pulse scrambling the agent's scanners and throwing them off balance. Ellie clutched the distortion timekeeper, its black glow flickering as if reacting to the conflict. Magnus lunged toward them, but Tobias blocked him, wielding a crowbar with surprising agility. Ellie darted past the agents, her focus on the staircase leading back to the surface. "Go, Ellie!" Tobias shouted. "I'll hold them off." Ellie hesitated for a split second, then forced herself to run. As she ascended the staircase, the distortion timekeeper began to hum, its energy vibrating in her hands. She glanced back, her heart sinking as she saw Tobias locked in combat with Magnus. "I can't leave him behind," she thought. Summoning her courage, Ellie turned the dial on the distortion timekeeper. A ripple of energy surged outward, warping the air around her. Time seemed to fracture, creating overlapping layers of reality. Magnus froze mid-strike, his movement slowed to a crawl. Tobias stared at Ellie in astonishment. "What did you do?" he asked. "I don't know," Ellie admitted, her voice shaking. "But it's working. Let's go." Tobias didn't argue. Together, they bolted up the staircase, leaving the distorted agents and Magnus behind. When they reached the surface, the storm had returned with a vengeance. Rain poured in sheets, and the wind howled around them. Ellie and Tobias climbed into the truck, the timekeeper secured in the back seat. "We did it," Ellie said, her voice trembling with relief. Tobias gave her a small smile. "For now. But this is far from over." Ellie nodded, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. The timekeepers hummed softly, their energy pulsing in harmony. As the truck roared into the stormy night, Ellie knew their journey was only beginning. The fate of time itself hung in the balance, and she was determined to see it through. Chapter 8, The Eternal Clock. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the world quiet and heavy with mist. The truck rumbled down an empty road, the three timekeepers humming softly in unison. Ellie sat in the passenger seat, clutching her grandfather's journal, while Tobias drove in tense silence. "This is it, isn't it?" Ellie finally asked. Tobias nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "The final stretch. Once we reach the clockmaker's observatory, we'll have everything we need to face the eternal clock." Ellie exhaled, her heart pounding. The observatory was more than just a location, it was the heart of her grandfather's work, the place where the eternal clock had first been constructed. It was also where Elias Thatcher's vision of time had nearly destroyed him, and his family. "Do you think it can be destroyed?" she asked, her voice quiet. Tobias glanced at her. "I don't know. But if we can sever the network linking the timekeepers to the eternal clock, it might render it powerless." Ellie tightened her grip on the journal. "And if we can't?" Tobias didn't answer. They arrived at the observatory as the sun broke through the mist, casting the old structure in golden light. The building was perched on a hill, its domed roof glinting faintly. Ivy crept up its walls, and its windows were dark, giving the impression of a long-forgotten relic. "This place is haunting," Ellie murmured as they climbed out of the truck. "It hasn't been used in years," Tobias said. "But the mechanisms inside should still work. If the eternal clock is still connected, we'll find it here." Carrying the timekeepers, they made their way inside. The interior of the observatory was both beautiful and eerie. The main chamber was dominated by a massive central mechanism, its gears and cogs long since stilled. Surrounding it were countless tables and shelves, cluttered with old blueprints, tools, and notes in Elias's handwriting. Ellie felt a pang of sadness as she ran her fingers over the dusty papers. "This was his life," she whispered. Tobias placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And now it's up to us to finish what he started." They set the timekeepers on a circular platform in the center of the chamber. Tobias studied the mechanism surrounding it, muttering to himself as he worked to align the devices. Ellie watched anxiously, her eyes darting to the shadows. "It's too quiet," she said. Tobias glanced at her. "Focus on the task. The order won't find us immediately, but we can't afford to waste time." The timekeepers began to glow as Tobias connected them to the central mechanism. The air in the chamber grew thick with energy, a low hum vibrating through the walls. "It's working," Tobias said, his voice laced with awe. "The timekeepers are syncing with the network." We'll be able to access the Eternal Clock's core soon. Ellie's stomach churned. And then what? Then we make the choice, Tobias said. To sever the network or let it continue. Before Ellie could respond, a loud crash echoed through the observatory. They're here, Tobias said grimly. Magnus Graves strode into the chamber, flanked by a dozen agents. His smirk was colder than ever. I should have known you'd bring the timekeepers here, Magnus said. The clockmaker's legacy always leads back to this place. Ellie stepped in front of the timekeepers, her hands clenched into fists. You won't take them. Magnus chuckled. You're brave, I'll give you that. But you're out of your depth, girl. The Eternal Clock's power is beyond your comprehension. Tobias drew a weapon from his belt. A makeshift baton reinforced with metal. Back off, Magnus. This ends here. Magnus sneered. Oh, it ends, all right. But not the way you think. The confrontation erupted into chaos. Tobias fought fiercely, using his knowledge of the Order's tactics to outmaneuver Magnus' agents. Ellie, meanwhile, grabbed the journal and darted toward the central mechanism, desperate to find a way to sever the connection. The timekeepers glowed brighter, their energy spiraling upward into the domed ceiling. Ellie could feel the immense power radiating from them, a force both mesmerizing and terrifying. Ellie! Tobias shouted, dodging a strike. You have to act now. Ellie flipped through the journal. Her grandfather's notes blurring before her eyes. Finally, she found the instructions she needed, a sequence of adjustments to the timekeepers that would destabilize the network. Her hands trembled as she approached the platform. Magnus saw what she was doing and lunged toward her, but Tobias intercepted him, the two grappling fiercely. You think you can destroy the Eternal Clock? Magnus roared. It's the source of all time. Without it, chaos will reign. Ellie ignored him, her focus on the timekeepers. She adjusted their dials, aligning them with the sequence in the journal. The hum of energy grew deafening, the room vibrating as the mechanism began to overload. Ellie, hurry! Tobias shouted. As Ellie turned the final dial, a blinding light erupted from the timekeepers. She was thrown backward, her ears ringing as the energy surged through the chamber. When she opened her eyes, the central mechanism was crumbling, its gears grinding to a halt. The timekeepers had stopped glowing, their hands frozen in place. Magnus staggered to his feet, his face twisted in rage. What have you done? Ellie stood, her voice steady. I severed the connection. The Eternal Clock is no longer in control. Magnus advanced on her, but Tobias stepped between them, his baton raised. You've lost, Magnus. It's over. Magnus glared at them both, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. The observatory was silent as Tobias and Ellie surveyed the damage. The timekeepers were inert, their power extinguished. We did it, Tobias said, his voice filled with relief. Ellie nodded, though her heart was heavy. But at what cost? Time feels different now. It will take time for the world to adjust, Tobias said. But we've given humanity the chance to control its own destiny. Ellie looked at the dormant timekeepers, a sense of closure washing over her. I think my grandfather would have been proud. Tobias placed a hand on her shoulder. He would have been. You've honored his legacy. As they left the observatory, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, bathing the world in golden light. Ellie looked back at the building one last time, a bittersweet smile on her face. The clockmaker's story is over, she said. But ours is just beginning. Tobias nodded. Let's make it a good one. With that, they walked away, leaving the past behind and stepping into a future full of endless possibilities. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Ellie and Tobias stood outside the ruined observatory. The dormant timekeepers lay behind them, their power extinguished, and the Eternal Clock's reign over time was finally broken. Ellie turned to Tobias with a small smile. We did it. The clockmaker's legacy is finally at peace, Tobias nodded. And the future is ours to shape. with one last glance at the past, they walked away, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. Thanks for joining us on this thrilling journey through time and legacy. If you enjoyed the Clockmaker's Heir, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible adventures. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a story, and share this tale with fellow adventurers. Stay tuned for our next epic journey. Until then, keep dreaming, keep exploring, and keep turning the pages of life.